August 19, 1944. Wehrmacht Headquarters, East Prussia. Oberst Alfred Jodl examined fresh intelligence from the crumbling Western Front. His staff had run the numbers. Allied supply routes extended roughly 400 miles from the Normandy beaches back to Patton's spearhead, the Third Army. The Americans had outrun their logistics. Patton's drive would stall within days, perhaps hours. No army could keep up such blistering tempo without fuel. From his post at Hitler's Wolfschanze, Jodl applied a lesson every German commander knew by experience. An advancing armored division burned about 150,000 gallons of fuel per day. With American forces now some 400 miles from their supply depots, the conclusion seemed inevitable. Patton's Third Army would grind to a halt, giving the Wehrmacht time to fall back to the Seine and perhaps hold through winter. What Jodl could not see was that 125 miles away, 5,958 trucks were already rolling east in an unending column. Headlights blazing against doctrine, carrying 2,500 tons of supplies every 24 hours. The Red Ball Express, a logistical gamble so bold, German military science had not imagined, was about to upend assumptions about mechanized warfare. Within 72 hours, the tanks that German planners expected to be immobilized would smash through positions on the Seine. Within a week, they would liberate Paris. Within a month, they would be standing on the German border. The Wehrmacht's sharpest minds were about to be taught a new lesson in American logistics. Delivered by 23,000 truck drivers, about 75% of them African-American, who converted a one-way highway concept into one of the most efficient military supply lines in history. The German General Staff's faith in an American logistical collapse grew out of decades of combat experience and recent precedent. The Wehrmacht had pioneered blitzkrieg, transformed combined arms warfare, and understood the tyranny of supply lines. Their own campaigns repeatedly stalled when logistics could not keep pace with tactical success. In Russia, the German advance was undone not at first by Soviet fire, but by the simple inability to feed and fuel formations across vast distances. German trucks broke down on Russian roads. Horse-drawn wagons, still about 80% of German transport, could not match Panzer spearheads. Differing railway gauges left supplies piled up hundreds of miles from the front. Heinrich von Leutwitz, a panzer trooper who would command the 47th Panzer Corps from September 1944, wrote in July that the Americans faced the same logistical impossibility Germany had faced in Russia. Their mechanical edge, he warned, could become a liability. Machines need fuel, ammunition, and parts. They had advanced 400 miles in 30 days. History, he argued, taught what came next: paralysis. German intelligence tracked American consumption closely. A single Sherman used roughly 0.5 gallons per mile on roads and even more cross-country. An infantry division required about 700 tons of supplies daily. An armored division about 1,000 tons. Patton commanded 12 divisions pushing along a 60-mile front. The arithmetic appeared unassailable. Roughly 12,000 tons a day moved 400 miles from the beaches over damaged roads, and a transport network the Germans had systematically wrecked during their retreat. Major Siegfried Westphal, who would become Chief of Staff to Field Marshal von Rundstedt in September, calculated on August 20th that even if the Americans had unlimited trucks, which they did not, perfect roads, which they did not, and no mechanical failures, impossible, they still could not sustain Patton's advance for more than another 48 hours. Physical laws, he argued, did not bend for industry. At 2:00 p.m. on August 25, 1944, in a requisitioned French chateau near Ley, Lieutenant Colonel Lauren Ayers of the Motor Transport Service faced skeptical officers and laid out stark figures. Patton's Third Army was consuming supplies faster than any army in history, and advancing at rates that overwhelmed conventional logistics. Railways, scheduled convoys, and depot-based distribution had collapsed under the strain. "Gentlemen," Ayers announced, "we will create a one-way highway from Cherbourg and the beaches to the front. Every vehicle will run 20 hours out of 24. No stopping except for fuel and emergencies. We will move a minimum of 12,500 tons daily." The name borrowed railroad jargon. A Red Ball freight was an express shipment that took absolute priority. The Red Ball Express would follow the same rule. Total priority, No delays, no exceptions. The technical plan flouted German doctrine. 2 parallel one-way highways, loaded trucks outbound, empties returning. 24-hour operations with headlights on and blackout rules suspended. A no-stop policy save for fuel and breakdowns. 5-minute convoy intervals aiming for a 35 mm average. Mobile maintenance units every 50 miles. MP checkpoints to remove any vehicle traveling under 25 bmi. Colonel Charles O. Thrasher, commanding the Advance Section, Communications Zone, ADSEC, ran the projections. They needed 140 truck companies, at least 5,158 vehicles, operating at roughly 90% availability. Logistics textbooks said it could not be done. Yet within 36 hours, the impossible was operational. On August 26th, drivers from the 3916th Quartermaster Truck Company climbed into their GMC CCKW 2.5-ton deuce-and-a-half trucks loaded with 105 mm artillery shells bound for Patton's guns at Melun, 300 miles east. The makeup of the Red Ball Express would have stunned Nazi racial theorists. Of the roughly 23,000 drivers who would operate the route, about 75% were African-American soldiers serving in a still segregated army. Men who could not eat in many white restaurants or use white facilities at home were keeping the most celebrated white general's army moving. Within hours, the drivers developed their own culture, painting slogans on trucks. Patton's Blood Bank, Hitler Here We Come, Detroit to Berlin Express. Creating informal traffic rules. Slower vehicles pulled aside immediately. Mechanical failures were shoved into ditches, and any truck under 20 mph was treated as a roadblock. By August 28th, German reconnaissance began reporting something unprecedented. Units from Alf Clarong 116 radioed from observation points above the main Red Ball route, a continuous column of vehicles. Headlights visible for 20 kilometers, no spacing and no blackout discipline, an estimated 1,000 vehicles per hour. The Americans have abandoned all military precaution, read the reports. To German doctrine, this was suicidal. Lights at night invited air attack. Continuous columns were perfect artillery targets. Lack of spacing meant one disabled truck could halt an entire convoy. Yet the Americans seemed unconcerned. Lieutenant General Edgar Feuinger, commanding the 21st Panzer Division, observed the Red Ball Express from concealed positions on August 30th and reported to Army Group B. The enemy operates a supply system beyond our comprehension. Vehicles pass at 30-second intervals, day and night without pause. They don't hide, don't disperse, don't follow any rules. It's not military science. It's mass production applied to warfare. What the Germans could not grasp was that American logistics worked by different principles. Where German doctrine prized concealment, Americans relied on volume. Where Germans conserved vehicles, Americans planned for roughly 20% mechanical failure. Where Germans followed strict procedure, Americans improvised constantly. The tonnage the Red Ball Express moved contradicted German calculations of what was possible. In its first week, August 25 to 31, 1944, it delivered 89,139 tons of supplies. Average daily throughput reached 12,148 tons, with round trips of 686 miles. The fleet turnover depended on 5,158 trucks averaging about 1.5 runs a day, and the operation itself burned roughly 300,000 gallons of fuel daily. German logistics experts who saw these figures in captured American paperwork dismissed them as propaganda, but the data were real and rising. By September 5th, the Red Ball Express had found a tempo that stunned officers still relying on horse-drawn transport for some 80% of their haulage. Convoys left the western terminus every 5 minutes. The typical column numbered about 67 vehicles. The normal load per truck was 5 tons, 7 tons when frequently overloaded. A one-way journey of 350 miles took roughly 14 hours. Turnaround at each end consumed about 2 hours. And about 5,000 vehicles were in motion at any moment. The route spawned innovations by the hour as drivers and mechanics solved problems German doctrine had deemed insoluble. When roughly 1,800 breakdowns occurred each day, mobile repair teams worked roadside triage, fix it in 15 minutes or push it clear. Salvageable parts were stripped from beyond repair rigs. Whole engines were swapped in about 45 minutes with mobile cranes. When the main corridor clogged, drivers carved out alternate paths, pressed French buses into service to move personnel and free cargo trucks, repainted captured German vehicles and put them to work, and used rubble from bombed bridges as makeshift roadbeds to bypass destroyed spans. Observers in Berlin could not make sense of the chaos that produced order. German logistics doctrine prized careful planning, strict maintenance schedules, and precise procedure, yet American practice flouted every rule and grew faster rather than collapsing. The most startling revelation concerned fuel. The Red Ball Express consumed roughly 300,000 gallons a day just to operate. More than many German formations received for all purposes. Yet shortages never appeared because the Allies had built a parallel fuel system, including Operation PLUTO, the undersea pipelines across the Channel. By September 1944, fuel flowed through lines beneath the sea that German intelligence had not detected. Forward dumps were sighted every 25 miles along the route. Tanker convoys ran in parallel to guarantee no vehicle waited more than 10 minutes to refuel, and aerial photos showed fuel stocks at the front larger than Germany's strategic reserves. To German eyes, the Americans were literally burning more gasoline to move gasoline than Germany allotted to whole panzer divisions. This was not war as they understood it, but industrial excess applied to combat. The Red Ball Express did more than sustain an advance. It amplified its speed. Where German calculations allowed an armored division perhaps 20 to 30 miles per day in ideal conditions, Patton's formations, supplied by the Red Ball, averaged 40 to 60 miles per day for weeks. On September 1, 1944, the 4th Armored pushed 35 miles in the morning, paused at midday to draw supplies, and then moved another 32 miles in the afternoon. A 67-mile single-day march that shattered defensive planning built on a 30-mile ceiling. Oberst Heinz Guderian, reading the reports in East Prussia, initially refused to believe them. No armored force could sustain 60 miles a day for a week. Mechanical failures alone should prevent that, but intercepted American radio traffic confirmed the tempo. Even more unnerving was American brazenness on the airwaves. Units broadcast positions openly with little coding, confident they could move faster than the enemy could react. By September 5th, German intelligence had assembled exhaustive reports on the Red Ball Express, and the verdict was grim. Every assumption about American logistical limits needed revision. The reports cataloged practices that violated German military science, vehicles abandoned rather than painstakingly repaired, drivers kept awake and moving with stimulants, a collapse of camouflage discipline that should have invited air attack which never came, mechanical failure rates running as high as 30% daily yet absorbed by sheer redundancy, and fuel consumption at levels that would have bankrupted any European army. Field Marshal Walter Model's reaction betrayed a new kind of dread. If these accounts were accurate, Germany was not merely facing a superior army, but an opponent backed by an industrial civilization. They showed no fear. They squandered materiel because they could, and conventional tactics alone could not defeat that scale of resources. The human cost was severe and visible only on the road. Drivers ran for 72 straight hours, hallucinating from exhaustion and benzodrine, and roughly 300 men died in accidents during the Red Ball's operational period. Fog and broken roads turned convoys into hazards. Trucks collided in low visibility, overturned on rutted tracks, or caught fire when overheated engines ignited. Yet morale stayed remarkably high. The drivers, overwhelmingly African-American men who lacked full rights at home, understood they were making history and that every mile and every ton delivered undermined Nazi racial doctrine. Captured German officers offered blunt testimony about the Red Ball Express's effect. Oberst Hans von Luck, taken prisoner in September 1944, told interrogators that once they grasped the Allied supply system, they knew defeat was near. The Americans disregarded rules, wasting fuel, abandoning vehicles, exhausting crews, but won by sheer scale, industrializing warfare beyond German comprehension. The psychological toll on German units was severe. Troops heard a constant river of engines at night, an audible reminder of inexhaustible materiel. Where a German rifleman might have 3 rounds, Americans were pouring in millions, and the incessant noise itself became a weapon. German engineers were astonished at the equipment. The GMC CCKW 2.5-ton deuce and a half exemplified mass production excellence. General Motors would produce over 500,000 by war's end, outnumbering all trucks in the German forces, and featured things the Germans had not standardized. All-wheel drive as a rule, automatic tire inflation systems, waterproofing for deep Fords, engines that tolerated poor quality fuel, and heaters that actually worked in winter. U.S. maintenance practices baffled them as well. Instead of rebuilding engines, Americans swapped them out. Instead of hoarding parts, they replaced whole vehicles for relatively minor faults. Instead of relying on a few master mechanics, thousands of competent technicians handled most repairs. As the front moved east, the Red Ball Express adapted at a pace that stunned German planners used to weeks of preparation. When the original corridor proved inadequate, new lines sprang up overnight. The White Ball Express, the Green Diamond, the Red Lion, and other routes, each put into operation within 48 hours. German staff officers required weeks to plan comparable operations, while Americans simply painted new markers, assigned trucks, and kept moving. The predominance of African-American drivers created cognitive dissonance for Nazi racial theorists. Men the regime labeled inferior were performing logistics feats the Wehrmacht could not match. And that irony only pushed the drivers harder. Each successful run was a rebuke to Hitler. German prisoners pressed into loading trucks often, found their assumptions shattered by African-American sergeants who balanced loads faster than German engineers and who frequently treated prisoners more fairly than Nazi propaganda had claimed. The Red Ball Express also built infrastructure Germans thought impossible in combat. Engineers repaired or reinforced 40 bridges, established 15 major fuel dumps, set up 26 maintenance stations, and erected 8 temporary towns for drivers, all while the line ran. A bridge at Monte that German planners expected would take 6 weeks to replace was reconstructed by American engineers in 14 hours, while convoys detoured only 8 miles over hastily graded bypasses. German officers watched American construction methods in disbelief. Few planning meetings, scant detailed blueprints, immediate action, and saw infrastructure appear overnight across French fields faster than they could destroy it. One especially alarming feat for German artillery officers was ammunition throughput. During the reduction of Metz's fortifications in September 1944, Allied guns fired roughly 100,000 rounds in 24 hours, and the Red Ball Express delivered every shell plus a 20% surplus. German defenders were limited to about 50 rounds per gun per day, an imbalance that was devastating since the Americans could sustain bombardments that German calculations said would require some 50 truckloads of ammunition per hour. The Express consumed vehicles at rates that would have paralyzed most armies. By late September, mechanical attrition was staggering. Average truck life fell to about 10,000 miles versus a peacetime norm near 30,000. Daily failure rates reached roughly 30% of the fleet. Engines were swapped at a rate of about 500 per week. Tires were burned through at roughly 10,000 per week, and more than 5,000 vehicles were destroyed or abandoned. Still, the flow never slackened. American industry had planned for these losses. Replacement ships arrived weekly with hundreds of new trucks, and relief drivers were trained in 2 days and thrown into the convoys. German estimates concluded the Americans were losing more trucks each week than the Wehrmacht even had in France. Yet Allied hauling capacity kept rising. They had accomplished what German planners deemed impossible: supply throughput outpacing consumption. French civilians along the Red Ball corridors watched an abundance that directly contradicted years of enforced scarcity, and the effect on occupied minds was immediate and deep. Many Red Ball drivers, especially African-American soldiers, routinely shared rations with local people despite rules to the contrary. At every stop, children gathered and were handed chocolate, cigarettes, soap, and small kindnesses. The contrast with German rationing was striking. German intelligence recorded the propaganda impact. Civilians began to view Allied victory as inevitable and cited the endless truck columns as proof. Resistance actions along Red Ball routes rose by roughly 400%, and populations that had tolerated occupation now actively opposed it. In early September 1944, the Red Ball reached a crisis point. Patton's push had stretched lines so far that even the Express strained to keep pace. The round trip topped 700 miles. Drivers were collapsing from exhaustion, and vehicles were wearing out faster than before, and German intercepts noted the stress. A German report on September 8th warned that American supply lines were showing signs of breakdown. Convoy spacing had widened from 5 to 15 minutes, and average speeds had fallen. The Wehrmacht thought the moment of vulnerability had arrived. What followed surprised them. Within 72 hours, the Americans restructured the flow. Intermediate transfer depots cut individual hauls to about 350 miles. Driver rotation schedules were introduced, forward repair bases were set up, and the number of assigned trucks was roughly doubled. By September 12th, daily tonnage actually rose. What should have halted the advance instead hardened the system. The Allies also added an aerial lifeline Germans had considered impractical at scale. C-47 transports flew supplies directly to forward units, each carrying roughly 3 tons. On September 16th, German observers logged about 900 transport sorties in a single day, delivering roughly 2,700 tons by air. The Luftwaffe at its height had managed only a few hundred tons daily into Stalingrad and regarded that as a maximal effort. The Americans treated transport aircraft like rolling trucks, accepting losses and overwhelming any attrition with sheer numbers. And the Wehrmacht had no industrial arithmetic to match it. The Red Ball ran on. Command practices that violated German military norms. Subordinate officers made choices German doctrine reserved for generals, and non-commissioned officers oversaw movements larger than many German colonels ever handled. The decentralization baffled staff officers. Lieutenants behaved like generals, sergeants like colonels. Chaos should have followed, but instead the system moved faster because local initiative replaced rigid central control. By October 1944, advancing railheads began to take pressure off the highway lifeline. The supply operation that had been planned for 10 days continued for 82, delivering about 412,000 tons of material over some 122 million ton miles. German commanders, now fighting on their own soil, reflected on what they had observed. Field Marshal Model later wrote that they had been undone not primarily by tanks or planes, but by American trucks. The rail transition was itself remarkable. U.S. railroad engineers rebuilt roughly 1,000 miles of shattered French track, while the Red Ball still ran, often using captured German equipment and laying new track faster than it could be destroyed. The final tallies defied German expectations. 82 days of operation, about 412,193 tons delivered, on the order of hundreds of millions of ton miles. Reports cited figures in the low hundreds of millions. An average fleet of 5,958 vehicles, peaking near 7,000. Some 23,000 drivers employed in total. Roughly 700,000 gallons of fuel moved daily. About 40,000 tons of ammunition sent to Patton alone. Some 15 million rations transported, and roughly 135,000 tons of medical supplies. German officers in captivity later admitted they had scaled expected Allied performance from European precedent and had underestimated by an order of magnitude. Beyond raw tonnage, the Red Ball exacted a deeper blow. It undermined German belief in their own superiority. Officers who had dismissed Americans as soft and dependent on machines watched those same soldiers perform logistical feats born of industrial scale and sheer determination. Prisoners watched Red Ball convoys pass, and some wept. They understood that the enemy could squander resources faster than Germany could produce them, and that realization eroded an entire worldview. One truck at a time. The operation also forced a bitter reckoning inside the U.S. Army. The Express depended overwhelmingly on African-American soldiers who remained segregated, denied equal facilities, and sidelined from many combat roles. When Eisenhower visited Red Ball installations in September 1944, his aide, Captain Harry Butcher, recorded that the commander watched colored drivers working 20-hour shifts and said, "These men are winning the war as surely as any infantry. We need to reconsider many things." The performance on French roads created pressure toward integration and helped build the case for desegregation. 3 years later, African American soldiers could point to the Red Ball as proof that, given equipment and opportunity, they matched any unit. Nazi racial theorists struggled to explain the contradiction. Some SS publications simply stopped addressing Allied logistics because the evidence was too damaging. After the war, German military engineers studied Red Ball operations intensively, and the lessons reshaped logistics doctrine worldwide. Scale can overwhelm inefficiency. Redundancy reduces vulnerability. Decentralized execution produces speed, and standardization multiplies capacity. People can endure far more than many expected. In 1950, Franz Halder, the former chief of the German General Staff, wrote that the Red Ball Express proved supply-shaped strategy rather than strategy-shaping supply, an insight the Americans grasped earlier than German commanders did. Within the roughly 23,000 men who drove the route, countless individual acts of courage appeared that left German observers baffled and were confirmed in service records. Corporal John L. Houston kept his rig moving for 2 full days, delivering shells to the 2nd Armored Division at Camry, nodding off at the wheel 3 times and being roused by fellow drivers each time. Private Booker T. Washington drove a burning truck loaded with medical supplies 2 miles to a field hospital rather than abandon the load. The cargo saved wounded soldiers from both sides. These episodes multiplied across the highway and revealed to German eyes a U.S. military culture that prized individual initiative, risk-taking calculated against mission needs, and getting the job done over strict paperwork. Compliance. In desperation, the Wehrmacht tried to mimic the system late in 1944. During the Ardennes, they planned to repurpose, captured American lorries to patch German supply lines, but the effort collapsed almost immediately. German drivers could not sustain Allied speeds. German mechanics struggled with unfamiliar equipment, fuel stocks were insufficient, and most crucially, the Germans lacked the American willingness to treat material as expendable. An officer in charge reported that dozens of captured trucks were deadlined within days, losses the Americans would simply have replaced, and he concluded that difference explained much of Germany's failure. The winter of 1944-45 put the Express to its sternest test. Freezing rain, ice, and snow should have stopped wheeled logistics. German doctrine claimed wheeled supply became impossible below -10 degrees Celsius. Instead, the Red Ball kept moving. Drivers wrapped chains on tires, poured alcohol into radiators, and accepted slower speeds, down from about 35 mph to nearer 15 mph, while keeping tonnage flowing. German observers watched ice-coated convoys push through storms that had halted panzer advances. The American system was inelegant by German standards, but effectively unstoppable. When the war ended, German logistics officers were required to study how the Express had worked, and their conclusions were unanimous and shattering to German pride. Infantry General Friedrich Schultz summarized the phenomenon as a temporary industrial civilization. Thousands of men and vehicles and millions of tons of material assembled for a single purpose and then dispersed when no longer needed. Heinz Guderian, architect of German armored doctrine, acknowledged that Blitzkrieg had never solved its core weakness, supply, and that the Americans had done so by sheer industrial scale. The Red Ball Express, he said, operated like a torrent of resources that overwhelmed German defenses. The operation cost the United States roughly $100 million in 1944. Vehicles worn out, fuel burned, roads damaged, and claims for civilian losses in France, an amount German staff officers could scarcely comprehend, but one U.S. planners regarded as cheap when set against results. The Express helped capture some 400,000 German troops, liberated France, Belgium, and Luxembourg, and is credited with shortening the war by an estimated 6 months. At an American daily war cost near $250 million, that reduction paid for the operation in a single day of saved combat. Lieutenant General John C. H. Lee, who ran theater logistics, later put it bluntly, they used up some 5,000 trucks and 23,000 men to break the German army in France. Catastrophic losses in earlier wars, but acceptable overhead for American industry. An unintended peacetime legacy was the transformation of U.S. civilian transport. Thousands of veterans left Europe with experience running the largest transport network ever assembled, then applied those lessons to commerce, founding trucking firms, shaping interstate highway thinking, and building the post-war logistics sector. Companies such as Yellow Freight, Roadway and Consolidated Freightways trace roots to veterans who learned that sheer volume and round-the-clock movement often beats small-scale efficiency. Military historians now treat the Red Ball Express as the defining logistics achievement in the European theater. Without it, Patton's thrust would have stalled, Paris would have fallen later, and German forces might have held stronger winter lines. On September 15, 1944, when Gerd von Rundstedt reviewed comprehensive intelligence on the operation, he told his staff they faced a problem beyond traditional military remedies. The Americans had made distance irrelevant. When a subordinate suggested using the Luftwaffe to cut the highway, von Rundstedt asked rhetorically how many trucks they would have to destroy and how many aircraft that would require. The point was brutal and clear. German means could not match American production. Behind the statistics were human tales that shaped perception on both sides. Drivers refusing relief because a stalled truck might never finish the run. Mechanics working through freezing rain to keep axles turning. Teenagers lying about their age to take the wheel. Those stories created a legend that quietly eroded German morale as convoys rolled past, one truck at a time. The Americans were far from soft, as enemy propaganda claimed. They pushed themselves harder than German horse teams ever did, and they did it of their own accord rather than out of fear, making them unexpectedly lethal by German calculations. The Red Ball Express became a form of inadvertent propaganda. German troops could hear the never-ending rumble of convoys at night, and that sound alone sapped morale. Commanders reported phantom convoys, engine noises broadcast toward enemy lines by Allied psychological warfare units produced the same demoralizing effect as real columns, because defenders believed supplies were endless while their own ammunition dwindled. In November 1944, with railheads partially restored, the Red Ball Express was officially stood down, but its practices had already transformed military logistics. Continuous, high-volume, seemingly wasteful resupply became an accepted American approach. The final logistical miracle was how quickly it vanished. Some 23,000 men, roughly 6,000 trucks, and hundreds of facilities were dismantled and reassigned within 72 hours. Vehicles shifted back into civilian hands, routes reopened for peacetime traffic, an agility that German planners could not match, since they needed months to cobble together even modest replacements. When German leaders surrendered in May 1945, many named the Express as evidence of hopelessness. One captured officer told interrogators that once they grasped Allied supply capacity, the war was effectively lost. The Americans could replace losses faster than Germany could destroy them. Field Marshal Albert Kessler, asked what surprised him most about U.S. forces, replied not tanks or aircraft but trucks. Americans had mobilized their entire industrial base for war, and Germany had been fighting factories as much as armies. The operation's headline figures are stark. 412,193 tons delivered. Some 122 million ton miles moved. An average daily fleet of 5,158 trucks with peaks near 7,000. 23,000 drivers employed overall. 82 operating days. Roughly 57 million gallons of fuel consumed. About 180,000 tires worn out. Over 5,000 vehicles destroyed or abandoned. A cost near $100 million. And an estimated 47 German divisions undone by Allied supply advantage. Figures that German staff officers could scarcely accept. The Express is credited with shortening the war by an estimated 180 days. In American accounting, the operation paid for itself many times over by accelerating victory. The Red Ball's success also produced cultural and institutional effects. Its mostly African-American drivers, segregated and denied equal treatment at home, were lionized by many senior leaders. General Patton himself later insisted that the truck crews deserved as much credit for victory as any combat formation, arguing that without their relentless movement, the Third Army could not have maintained momentum. Their performance helped push post-war debates about integration and reshaped civilian transport after the war as veterans used their skills to build the modern trucking industry. A final image endures. A German officer, watching an endless stream of Allied lorries pass every 5 minutes, asked how one defeats an enemy with more trucks than soldiers. The answer rolled past him in an unceasing convoy, an industrial torrent that turned supply into the decisive weapon of the European war and proved that in the age of mass production, logistics had become